Om Shanti.
Om Shanti.
Okay, this is a very warm welcome to everyone participating.
Many people have a one-sided idea of God. God is good, God is great, God is love, etc. Therefore, if you come to God through Brahmakumari's World Spiritual University, you assume that your entire experience should be good, great, and full of love. If your experience is otherwise, then you might conclude that, well, this is not God, or God is being misrepresented, etc. So in this EGY, we will explore the dark side of the sun. We will look at the negative experiences in the light of Gyan, and not in the light of religious preconceptions or of modern Western culture. Let's begin with an important piece of sociological research conducted by Tamazin Ramsey during 2013 to 2016. I selected a few sentences that I feel are important for this discussion and which help me convey my interpretation of what's happening and why people are having negative experiences of various kinds. So, in Tamazin Ramsey's documents, it says, despite the reduced interest in attending centers, there is a desire to create a mature learning environment and remain engaged with the knowledge. The sociology of organization and the politics of management confirm that the Brahmakumari's organization is vulnerable to many of the same afflictions experienced by other organizations like fear of disrepute, prioritizing the system of the stakeholders, and maintaining old patterns of operating and behaving even if those patterns no longer work. Long-term dedicated BKs have started reshaping their spiritual lives to coincide with deep spiritual values, even though these may conflict with the customs and systems of Indian culture, which is the home culture of our organization. Many dedicated BKs have since decided to withdraw from the Brahmakumari's organization and find their own way with the spiritual practice of Raj Yoga. There's no desire to leave the spiritual practice. Conversely, BKs who left the organizational structure still showed great interest in attending retreats, having meaningful exchanges with their spiritual peers, strengthening friendships on a face-to-face level, and experimenting with meditation practices. BKs reported that centers as they currently exist don't always offer a good environment for deep Raj Yoga practice outside of an outdated teacher-student role. The majority of our participants who have the most organizational involvement, like center or retreat coordinators, report feeling stressed, out of balance, and burdened by service and organizational obligations in addition to their worldly obligations. They are less happy and content and express symptoms of burnout. In our Yagya history, every phase of change was spearheaded by peer groups who had a vision. They created their own authentic tradition and ways of serving while remaining true to the original principles. They seek an authentic, living, and non-religious spiritual life. The solid personal connection with the roots of the Yagya make it possible to offer the gift of our own specialities in an unlimited way and to adapt to changing situations. Our studies reveal a need for more trust and real inclusion. Sometimes a misunderstanding of Gyan can lead to spiritual bypassing and interfere with authentic spiritual growth, resulting in depression, blockages, low self-esteem, or hopelessness. The word trust is used because perhaps people assume the behavior implies they're not trusted but they might be being discriminated against. This aspect needs to be investigated. This is related to the colonial past of India, and literateurs such as Abdul Razak Gurna and V.S. Naipaul in his book India, A Wounded Civilization, and others have described the impact of colonialism on the people of India, whether in India or the Indian diaspora. Gyan may be transmitted in a misleading way in the Western world by many of the BK teachers, and this needs to be addressed. The pedagogy is the traditional Indian way of teaching school children by rote, and this convention became obviously outdated during the beginning of the 20th century and is quite unsuitable in the 21st century. This can easily be corrected. Some Indian BKs in position of responsibility may fear that the Europeans might take over or alter the yagya, and are therefore strongly resistant to any form of innovation or improvement of the teaching methods, and may prefer to exclude such individuals. A couple of questions. How can the excellent infrastructure of the organization support a higher quality and level of spiritual education? Then how best to develop the teachers and prepare good spiritual educators? Some elements to be considered. Many people observe their situation in the BK world through a filter of preconceptions that causes them to project and to not see what needs to be seen. Some people are disappointed with their perception of God and His instruments. Now, if you rely on people's perception to arrive at solutions, you may fail completely. If people could have figured it out, there would be no need for God. The BK, RCs, CCs, NCs, etc. may not articulate Gyan in a relevant way. Very few souls understand the spiritual knowledge in depth. So our main challenge may be to get the Gyan articulated in a more relevant way. All the respondents to the survey and the people who made the survey are obligated to rely on sometimes limiting or misleading translations of Baba's Murlis. Therefore, their awareness of the Gyan can be skewed. It is possible and important to articulate the knowledge accurately. Once people know what the knowledge is, they are in a position to decide whether or not they want to study it and pursue the path of Raj Yoga. And very few BK teachers know the Gyan independently of its current religious packaging. So to be borne in mind, well, Shiv Baba is in charge of the yagya. This is his yagya. He has come to earth in order to give the accurate knowledge of the Gita, and he wants us, on his behalf, to challenge the current format of the Gita, which was altered by the Shankaracharyas to promote Vedic knowledge, which covers only matter, and this whole aspect of the omnipresence of God. So Shiv Baba has provided us with all the information necessary for this project. We can and must articulate exactly what the current BK management has achieved. The BK organization has achieved the network and infrastructure that Shiv Baba needs for the next phase of his task. BKs are doing various programs, etc., which passes the time, and that's fine, but soon we have to do everything on another level, so that will be in the past history, and the infrastructure will be used to teach the knowledge at greater depth and relevance to the wider world. So the special job of the group explorations of Gyan and Yoga is to explore Gyan and Yoga. Baba has predicted that a time will come when people really want Gyan and Yoga, and we think we are being tasked to prepare that. If you ask existing BKs what they want, that may not correspond with what Sheep Baba's intentions are. As Maggie Pulido said, the BKs in the EGY group are experiencing sustenance, they feel they're being heard, and they are getting empowered. So that means we are fulfilling a need, we are doing the work of connecting people with Gyan and Yoga, therefore we should keep moving forward in this direction. The numbers of participants are slowly growing, steadily. The languages the EGY is translated into are also growing steadily. We must not forget that the Brahma Kumaris is the organization, the scaffolding that enables something to get built, but it is not the building itself. It is an elaborate and ideal infrastructure upon which to create an educational and cultural environment for the next phase of development. Now I would like to read some points that emerged from the planning meeting of the little group that plans the EGY events. So, one question, are we looking at completely reinventing the BKs? Well, the EGY is a kind of R&D. We sit together in a small group, like the EGY planning team, or the French Brothers group that meets after each EGY session, or the bigger group like the actual EGY sessions to present and explore new ways of thinking. The Murli notes also explore and churn about the Murlis differently, giving people access to the Gyan in a non-religious manner. English Murli translation doesn't generally present God's words with the same feeling and significance as the original material, and the way it's translated sometimes presumes the listeners have a religious mentality, like young children being taught the catechism. The tone is sometimes a form of infantilization and addressing the listeners as if they were very young children who don't know anything and have to be corrected all the time. So the teachers convey their own mental attitude along with the knowledge. In EGY, perhaps we have a different mental attitude which is just as valid as that one, perhaps even more so. We are very clear about the difference between Hindu Bhakti and spiritual knowledge, the Gyan that Shiv Baba is giving. There are two sources of current Hindu Bhakti. One source originates in the Shankaracharyas from the 8th century, and the gathering of the Shankaracharyas actually rewrote the scriptures from earlier times, and they created a certain attitude towards women, a little bit reminiscent of the Taliban. And the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta is that everything is one thing, rather like Einstein's general theory of relativity. However, they apply this idea to the spirit, but the study of matter doesn't apply to the spirit. The other source is fairy tales, myths, legends, and stories. The people who come in Gyan are communicated to sometimes as someone who is an arrogant science-based person, or someone who is infantile, not so intelligent, a very simple Hindu devotee. But there are a lot of people who are neither arrogant scientists nor infantile and stupid. They really want to understand this material. The majority of people who are part of the BK congregation tend to be middle-class Hindu devotees, small business people, farmers, traditionally interested in money, power, property, prestige, position, protection. And Dadi Prakash Mani used to accuse BKs of this mentality when they're body conscious, but I think no one paid attention to this or thought about the implications. We need to present the Gyan for the Western world in a way, in a language, a format, and with iconography and literature which corresponds to who we are and who Baba is. Does this mean that we want to sell the same product with a new packaging? Actually, this product is so subtle that it can't be communicated without a packaging. The current packet is Hindu Bhakti and Hindu conventional traditional social attitudes, and now we need to make a new packet that applies to the Western world. The same product in a new package. We are the packets. We study, imbibe and transmit what we learn from Baba in terms of the four subjects of Gyan, Yoga, Dharana and service. Reinvention of the BK organization implies reinvention of the self as a BK. The organization is a document, but it's also the people who form the gathering that we call ourselves the Brahma Kumari's World Spiritual University. A recurrent question persists. What is this? Consider the frequently quoted aphorism in the Murlis, Miruamut Maluka Shikar, which literally means death to the mouse and lunch for the cat, as one of the stories. Generally, this is translated as death to the prey and victory for the hunter. And it sort of implies that the community is basically people who may take the position of predators or victims, but we don't want to be either of those, and there are other ways to relate. Now, Western BKs who are suffering need to stop buying into the patriarchal traditional social conditioning, which is typical in the Asian world today of diminishing and infantilizing women in particular. And this form of socialization is actually alien to the post-war Western cultural conditioning, and Westerners who are exposed to this get easily damaged through this kind of social manipulation. They're not used to it. It actually has no connection with the spiritual practice, but it's more of a cultural context. Women and girls from these cultures are aware from childhood of these practices, and they quickly learn the survival tactics that are also part of the culture. However, it's well known, survival tactics invariably take the form of character defects. So what are the unmet needs of the non-traditional Indian and of the non-Indian BK world? What are the unmet needs of the outside world? Messages received from BKs across the world indicate that the Brahmin family as a whole is not doing so well. There is real, intense emotional, financial, and physical suffering going on among people in Gyan from 5 to 30 years or longer that needs to be addressed. There is an assumption that the BKs are in the context of an institution that gives people what they need. And people don't want to belong to an institution where they don't feel supported, cared for, and loved. So souls are suffering silently for a long time, and then they leave. They do Amrit Vela meditation, Murli, all the BK practices alone, but not associated with any center. And this is not because of the pandemic, but they're saying, what's the point of going to the center? So this applies to many who have been following Baba's teachings for decades. Now, quite a few of those are in a position in the BK organization and for one reason or another got pushed out or left or whatever. So our first focus of attention has to be the Brahmins. The assets of the Yagya are the people, the teachers. This is the wealth. And the knowledge is contained in these packets. We ourselves are the packets. Baba had said, you are the message. In that case, when people see us and feel us, they get it. People are saying that through EGY and Murli notes, they are getting enabled to return to Baba. They're receiving the knowledge in a way that feels good to them. So as agents of change, we may be passing through the 3 stages mentioned by Schopenhauer. When you want to change something, first they ridicule you, then they give you strong opposition, and then later on you get accepted. So it means that this work can move forward and gradually gain acceptance. I think on our side is a natural evolution. There are also signs from the Avyak Murlis that Shiv Baba and Brahma Baba are not totally content with what's going on. We can affirm ourselves, move forward, and empower the Shiv Shaktis. We need to go through the basic course material using the power of discrimination to discern what is really soul consciousness. People need to understand that when you take up this spiritual practice, there will be many forms of opposition. In this case, the opposition comes not from the outside world, but from within the BK family. Baba has given us knowledge to develop ourselves in the context of a society which is opposed to change. And the traditional BK world is very resistant and opposed to anyone wanting to reinvent the wheel or function in the context of modern life. One issue is nationalism, the Hindutva. This mentality creates the attitude of excluding anyone who is not of the same persuasion and background. As ancient deity souls who have reincarnated in our current bodies, but are no less Indian than any of the rest of them, we have been selected to carry the yagya forward. The BK format gets altered whenever there is powerful leadership. It doesn't have to be an individual, but leadership from a group within the gathering. When Dadi Prakashmani came on after Brahma Baba, she changed the BKs quite a bit. Most people do not know that the yagya has undergone reinvention several times. Many think that it has continued in the same way since the beginning, but this isn't totally true. Dadi Prakashmani modernized it and developed it into a huge international organization. When people get very old, as is the current leadership, there's a natural tendency to revert to the sanskaras of their young age and the culture they were brought up in. So now perhaps it is a good time to see about moving above and beyond any limitations of the traditional Hindu framework. Of course, this is a big challenge, complex. Whether it can be done or not remains to be seen.
Thank you.
Shanti, yes. So I hope you have your seatbelt on. This is quite an explosive piece of material, but let's see how we go with this. As you mentioned, Magla, this has been in existence since 2013, so that's 9 years. And these kinds of things have been talked about for many, many, many years. And there is, I think, an assumption that gradually this will get addressed. And I think that in different circumstances it has been. But it hasn't really been addressed in a larger forum. I think that when we did the program called Global Functioning, it was addressed and it moved forward quite well. But then it clashed with the traditional BK way, and it was stopped, which is totally understandable. So why we're looking at this today is because there are just so many people who are saying we are in trouble, we don't understand what's happening, we don't understand why we're in trouble. And nobody really takes up that subject in a manner that is other than you as an individual are in trouble, therefore you should make more effort or, behave yourself or something like that. And so that actually increases the trouble that they're experiencing. And so I wanted to take this up, not from the angle, as I mentioned in this document, not from the angle of looking at it from a preconception, from a religious angle, or a preconception from an organizational angle. And this is the angle that most people look at it from. We tend to use the word if then. And I think what I want to do today is to really describe and define what happens in the process of purification. Very often this question, what is this, is asked. What is this Brahma Kumaris? Exactly what is it? And it's been very difficult to give an answer to that question. Baba says it is a university cum hospital. So if we take the aspect of hospital, what happens in a hospital is people come into a hospital because they are suffering from some illness or another. And then they are treated in the hospital with some medicine which will make the illness go away. So this is the analogy that Baba gives. And then when we say that this is a spiritual university, it means you're a student and you come to class and you study and there are exams and there's a whole structure of the university and various ceremonies and celebrations and whatnot that normally happens in a university. And there is a specific type of pedagogy. And so what we mentioned in this document is there's a problem with the pedagogy, and that is very easy to fix. So the pedagogy that we have is the pedagogy that has been used in India for, I would say, centuries, which is people are taught something by a teacher and they are supposed to learn it by heart. And when they're questioned, they're supposed to give the answer which they have learned by heart. And so the people are not taught how to think. They're just taught how to give back what they've been given. And this type of pedagogy used to be there in the Western world, and it basically finished around the time of the First World War, which was before the BK World Spiritual University began. And so people in the Western world, and I'm talking especially here about the relationship between people in the Western world and the BK Raj Yoga method of teaching. So people in the Western world know very well that this method of repeating Murli points is not a very good way to learn. But it is the way that is there, and it doesn't have to be. So what people generally do is they say, okay, instead of doing that, we will give our own opinion. So then they do that, which is okay, but it doesn't really get you very far either. What I feel is very important, which Shiv Baba teaches, which Brahma Baba teaches, which was taught to us in the early years of the 70s, 80s, 90s by Daddy Janki, is how to churn. And this process of how to churn is an extremely good form of pedagogy, but it is not taught by most of the BK teachers from India who perhaps did not get the exposure to Daddy Janki that we got, because Daddy Janki really was first class, excellent teacher of how to churn. Daddy Gulzar also first class churner. Daddy Prakash Mani, first class churner. So these three are really good teachers, and they taught people how to think, how to process the knowledge, and how to extract the butter. But this is not taught, generally speaking. So one thing that I would encourage is for this method of churning, or this concept of churning, needs to be brought in a very clear way. And I think that is going to help quite a lot. It's entirely different from repeating points. And it's also entirely different from giving your opinion. So that needs to be clarified. I'm not going to do that here, but just to point out that this is something that is very doable, very, very doable, and which I think will make a very big difference. But I know from my discussions with my very good friend, Sister Wendy from the center in Rome, who is a very, very deep churner, that she encounters a great deal of resistance to churning by the other people who are around her. And so I can understand from that there are many people who don't want to do it. And one reason they don't want to do it is because they never learned in their entire educational development how to think. And they may have an intense reaction against having to do that work in later years, because when you learn to do it as a child, it's okay. But if you have to start learning how to think when you're in your 40s and 50s, that's something that is very disturbing to a person. But it doesn't mean it can't be done. So I think that's one of the very easy things. The other thing that I think is very important connected with that is preparing the teachers. I give a lot of attention to this because in the early days when Bap Dada used to meet us personally, this is something that he told me I have to do. So I try and do it. He said, you have to teach the teachers. You have to prepare the teachers and get them ready so that they can teach this knowledge in such a way that people can understand it at depth. And so this is something that I'm very interested in. And let's see what can happen with that. I did have a very, very good experience trying to do that with a group of about, I think it must have been about 50 Kumaris from India. And they were in their 20s. So they were young Kumaris. And I had them for 1 month. And it was in the monsoon time in Mount Abu. We had Suktam, that whole building. And we spent the entire time studying together about the material in value education that I had done. So this would have been around 2005 or something like that. And I exposed them to a lot of ways of learning, ways of studying, ways of developing the intellect that are quite common and well known in the Western world, but which are not used in India. And these girls were really very bright, and they picked it up really well, and they learned how to think for themselves. But when they went back into their traditional BK center environment, there was a very, very strong reaction from the seniors who didn't really like the idea of having people who think for themselves. So this is really an interesting situation where you have a clash of cultures, and it's not a clash between Indian culture and non-Indian culture. It's a clash between the culture where you want to make the young people a certain way, and they do not have any leeway, left, right, or any other way, to be themselves. They have to be the way you want them, and no ifs, ands, or buts. And if you are an independent thinker, that is equated with you're a bad person. And it's not actually true that being an independent thinker is the same as being a person with lots of vices. That's completely a different thing. And so this is actually quite an important thing. So an independent thinker doesn't mean that you go against God. But what it does mean is that you develop your intellect, and you use different methods which are tried and tested since a long time for developing your own intellect, because when you do that, you are able to innovate, you're able to be creative, you're able to carry the thing forward. Baba had many, many times said, the material that I give you, the murli, is grass. This is simple. It's grass. And you are cows, sacred cows. Cows means women. And the majority of people who are trained in this way are women. It's the tradition in Brahma Kumaris, is why we call ourselves Brahma Kumaris. The women are given an education. They are offered positions of responsibility, administrative responsibility, to manage the yajna and to teach. And this is counter to the tradition of the patriarchy of India. And this is why there was so much big reactions to Brahma Baba when he initiated all these things under the direction of Shiv Baba. And why did Shiv Baba do this? Is because the patriarchal culture that he landed in was out of balance, very skewed towards the males and against the females. And he said, you need to restore the balance, because why the world is in this terrible situation where it's about to have destruction, a lot of it is to do with the social imbalance, and that women were put in very low position and discriminated against in a very extreme way, which we are seeing playing out in Afghanistan now that the Taliban has taken over, and women are not allowed to be educated. They have to be wrapped up in veils, hidden away, kept inside the four walls of the house, and used and abused however the men want. And Shiv Baba says, who are you to behave like that? What do you think you are? This is unacceptable. Wait a minute, let me tell you a few things. And one very important thing he says is that, look, every soul reincarnates. And every time you reincarnate, you change gender. So don't tell me you are men and they are women. That's only bodies. It has nothing to do with reality. Reality is every soul, the aim that he gives to every soul is you become Vishnu. Vishnu is an androgynous figure called the two forms or the dual form of Lakshmi and Narayan. That means each and every one of us needs to develop our sanskaras where there is a balance, perfect balance of masculine and feminine. And so what Baba did in the early years of the yagya is to get the women to do activities that are traditionally only for men, and to get the men to step back. And now, how many people can do that? That was absolutely unheard of and very, very different. But yet, Baba had a solid core of about 300 people in the what is called the bhatti, the early years of the yagya, the first 14 years. And then during that period, the Second World War took place, partition of India, Pakistan, and then the BKs who were in what then became Pakistan, they moved to India, to Mount Abu. And then there was from about 1952 or so to 1969, the BKs were with Brahma Baba and Mama, and they began service of India. And the BKs have always been revolutionary, but now not. Now BKs have become quite traditional, quite patriarchal, and this revolutionary way of being is kind of hidden away. And it's necessary that it became like that because during the process of spreading into the world of India, and since 1971 into the world of the West, which means the Indian diaspora, which is all over the world, and quite a few people from different religions, different races, different backgrounds also recognized Baba, came on board, and then the BK community became an international community. Of course, the overwhelming majority is from India, and in the Western world, if you look at any photograph of the double foreigners standing up when Bap Dada says, double foreigners stand up, as he did in the Murli that we saw televised yesterday, the overwhelming majority of double foreigners are with Indian faces, right? And so, yet, the golden age, the sanskaras of the golden age are not at all the same as what we know as conventional, traditional Indian culture. It's really not the same, because conventional Indian culture is patriarchal, unbalanced, and now very nationalistic. And that's okay. But now we have this phenomenon, which is why we are taking this up in this EGY. We have the phenomenon of people who are experiencing suffering in the context of the BK organization. And they're experiencing suffering. And so I want to talk about why people are experiencing suffering, I think it's very important to understand that there are different elements which cause a person to suffer. And I have lived many years in India. I've lived many years in America, in Europe. I've traveled all over the place. I've lived in Western centers, Indian centers, retreat centers, here, there, and everywhere. So I have a pretty wide type of experience of 48 years in the BKs. And I've seen it grow from quite small to very large. I've been involved in the middle and in the outside, and so I can see quite well from a number of different directions. And one thing that people, I think, and also the material that Magla read from Tamazin Ramsey's survey and study, which was very professionally conducted. And she has done a whole big thesis about this very, very professionally conducted material, looking at it as an organization in the mid-20th, the late 20th century and 21st century. When you say this is an organization, that's okay, but it's also something else. And this is invisible. And this invisible part is the part that gives the suffering. So I'm trying to make this invisible part visible. And that has to do with the fact that the practice of Raj Yoga is not really about becoming a nice, peaceful, pure, happy, nice, shining person. We will eventually become that. But what it's also about is the whole process of purification of the soul. And yesterday I was meeting with the instruments from South America to take up the subject of purity and purification. And I said quite a few things which I have put on a little YouTube thing, so you can see that. We need to understand that when you are going through the process of purification, there is suffering involved. And nobody will tell you that except me. And why I'm telling you that is because in the traditional culture of India, it's understood that there will be suffering, and it's understood that you won't talk about it. That's just one of those things. And in the traditional Indian marriage ceremony, the groom will give a handful of salt to the bride, right? Handful of salt is given to the bride. What that means is beware, because your ride is going to be salty. And so it's known. And because if you go into the extended traditional Indian family as a daughter-in-law, where the people are full of virtues, there's no problem. But where the people are not full of virtues, and they may use and abuse you, they may be aggressive, they may be very aggressive, but you are on the bottom of the pile. And so you have to be very tough, because you have to endure a lot of things that in the original setup of the extended Indian family, it was not anticipated that you'd have to endure that much suffering. And this was set up in about 1,000 years ago from now, and it's all written down in the Manusmriti scripture, which nobody reads. But I read it because I needed to know, what is this? The laws of Manu. And this was the description of how you should live in the conventional, traditional Indian world, which is patriarchal and dominated by the men. And that means that you are at the mercy of that system because there's no checks and balances. In the United States, the system of the US Constitution is it's all about checks and balances because they wanted to make sure that there wasn't slavery, that there wasn't abuse, that there was equal opportunity. And in the 1945, the Declaration of Human Rights was put together by Eleanor Roosevelt, and so that you know what your rights are. But in the traditional, conventional Indian society, as described 1,000 years ago, the beginning of Vedic India, you didn't have any rights. No rights. And so you depended on everybody being virtuous. But now it's the end of the Iron Age and people are spiritually weak and the degree of violence and abuse and whatnot is quite high. And so there is a culture of predators and victims. And this is not just in India, this is all over the world. But in India, it's quite strong. In the Arabic countries, it's very strong. And in other parts of Asia, very, very strong. And in Africa, also very, very strong. In Australia, very strong. And yet, here is Baba, who says, what I want to do is create balance in the society. Because if you have balance, then everything will work nicely. Now we're dealing with climate change, which is also a sign of the elements of matter being very severely out of balance. So the human world is out of balance, the elements of matter are out of balance. And our study and practice of Raj Yoga under the direction of God is all about coming back into balance. So our methods and systems need to reflect that. I think that's important. But what I also want to talk about is the extraction of impurities from the soul. And this is really where the suffering comes in. In India, mostly it is understood and expected that you will suffer through illness, physical illness. And in my researches with some sociologists of India, generally speaking, if a girl is suffering in her family from emotional abuse or sexual abuse or social abuse, she does not have the right to describe it in that manner. What she can only describe it in the form of physical suffering. So what happens is the emotional suffering gets suppressed, and it's normal, it transfers into heart disease or any other kind of illness. And sometimes people handle their suffering by overeating. This is why you get a lot of people who are very obese, which is because one way to handle it is to stuff it. So you stuff the food in. And so this happens. But when you put the same circumstances into people of Western culture, they will not do that. And they will say what's happening, and they will experience the suffering, mental suffering, emotional suffering, social suffering, constriction, constraints, restriction, all this type of thing. It will be expressed because it's normal in the culture to say, hey, yeah, this is what is happening. But it's not allowed. And so people do suppress it a lot, but then it comes out as many different kinds of suffering. And what is very normal is to point the finger at where you see the suffering coming from. You say, the yagya is making me suffer, or the other BKs are making me suffer, or something like this. But what we need to understand is that the phenomenon of suffering, that the phenomenon of pain is absolutely connected with the process of purification. So we need to realize that when you come into the BKs, you are, and this is something that was specially said for Mount Abu, for Madhuban, because Madhuban is known to be the hottest place of this sacrificial fire, the hottest place. It's the high intensity spiritual vibrations, very high intensity. I lived there 10 years. I'm very familiar with that high intensity. I love high intensity, not a problem. But when you are in a situation of high intensity, and centers are little mini yagyas, so there's high intensity, very high intensity vibrations. And what this will do is it will cause any kind of deep embedded poison in the soul in the form of outstanding karmic accounts to come to the surface. And it will trouble you mentally, emotionally, spiritually, financially, socially, physically, all sorts of things. You will be in a high stress situation. And our BK advertising says something about peace and happiness and all that. It doesn't say anything about, please come and learn Raj Yoga so that you can come into a high stress situation and then we'll pull out all your impurities. Nobody would come like that, would they? So it's not talked about. And, in ancient traditional cultures, it's kind of understood, but not very many people in the West are aware about that. So this is why I'm spelling it out. You come in this into a high intensity situation. And one thing we hear about a lot is change your sanskaras, right? Change your sanskaras. Have you ever seen anybody change their sanskaras? Not a single one, right? Why do we say this, change your sanskaras, when nobody changes their sanskaras? You can't change your sanskaras. What do? You try and change your sanskaras. Everybody says to you, oh, you have this bad sanskara and that bad sanskara. Well, they don't tell it to you directly. They say it to other people behind your back, and it gets back to you. One way or the other, the message comes, do something about your horrendous character. and now it cannot be done like that. That never worked. That's a religious way of doing things. And this is not really a religious practice. This is a spiritual practice. And a spiritual practice is very, very subtle. The transformation process that occurs in the context of a yagya is told by Baba in the Murlis in two ways. One way is he talks about gold, which has got alloy in it, and it gets put in a crucible and exposed to great heat. And then the impurities come to the surface and they get thrown out and burned. when you are that very same little piece of gold, and you are in this crucible called BK Center or BK Madhuban, and you will be heated up to very high temperature, way beyond boiling point. So if you boil over, it's not surprising. And all of this stuff will get extracted. And this is a very unpleasant process. And you will think that there's something wrong with your meditation when that's happening, right? Because your meditation is supposed to be, you become serene and blissful. Nobody said anything about you're going to boil over and all that. No, but it is like that. You will be put in high pressure, high temperature, and it will be very difficult. And Baba knows this, and he tells it quite diplomatically and indirectly, but most of the BK teachers will not tell you this. I think they should, but they don't. It's okay. So now, this is why he gives us powers. Power of tolerance, power of accommodation, power of discernment, power of judgment. All these different powers are so that we can handle what happens to us when we come into this purification environment, so that we can handle it. And so if you get confused when you're in this situation and no one tells you this, someone like me will say, hey, wait a minute, we need to tell you what's going on. So I do, you see, so that you're in a much better position to get through it. And also so that if you find that the temperature is too hot for you to handle, then it's perfectly okay for you to take a little bit of distance from the heat of the core of the yagya, so that you can gather together yourself and then go in again for a little bit more baking and roasting and all of that. And you are free to decide how much baking and roasting you want, how much you can handle, because, there are also things which Baba had said in the Murli. He said that the bhatti, which is a furnace of the 14 years, the bhatti is also a kiln, right? So a kiln is where you put bricks in. You make the mud bricks and you put them in a kiln and you fire them. That means you take them up to, maybe 1500 degrees centigrade. It's not exactly a day at the beach. It's way hotter than that. And he said that in the kiln, some of the bricks got baked firm and some of them exploded. And so this is there in the Murli. But what happens is you don't actually compute that you're a brick and you're in the kiln, and if all things go well, you'll turn out a firm, solid, good brick. But you don't want to be turned into a hard person. Because if you become a hard person, you'll be horrible to other people. So that would not look so good. But you do have to become tough. You do have to become resilient. And the example of that was really Mama. She was very, very tough. But she didn't behave towards others in an unkind manner. As some tough people are very awful to other people. You see that in big business. If you're going to be successful in big business, you have to abuse everybody. And be that way. Then you can make lots of money. But that's not going to get you to be a deity. Deities aren't like that. So now if you explode, okay, so in a kiln, the bricks that explode, they get thrown away. But which BK wants to be thrown away? I don't want to be thrown away. And you can't really repair an exploded brick. So, we need to think about it a little differently. And so this bhatti was for the first 14 years, and out of it, 300 people went in, about 100 people came out. So the majority exploded. Yeah. So BK Raj Yoga is not for the faint-hearted. But many people come to BK who are not fundamentally that strong to be able to handle this kind of cooking and baking and, all of that. So one thing I think is really very, very important is to understand, Baba keeps on using the word number wise. So we had to really understand that you must take responsibility for yourself, and that nobody has the right to tell you that you're not very good if you want to do this to the level that you want to do it at. But some people say, oh, no, useless speaking. No, you can't do that. You have to understand, everyone is free to pursue this process of purification at the rate and the intensity and to the degree that they want. Because we're volunteers, so we have to voluntarily go in the oven and voluntarily come out when it gets too hot and still be okay person. We don't need to explode. Now, the other thing is, the other example that Baba has given us is about the Ayurvedic medicine. Now, you come in here and the murli and the circumstances and everything will trigger your weaknesses. And any kind of poison will erupt. It can erupt in the form of behavior. It can erupt in the form of getting upset, getting depressed, getting self-doubt. All sorts of emotions will occur, all sorts of reactions and attitudes and all this type of thing. And this is because there's medicine going on here, and it's causing any poison that may have got into us to come to the surface and come out. And when we treat this process as a matter of behavior modification, it means we haven't understood what's going on here. This is not a kindergarten where you try and make all the children behave. This is not the right way to do it. You have to understand these are adults. They're going through a very deep, invisible purification process, and all kinds of eruptions will happen. And you have to create a space for that, safe space for that. And that's called family. You see, because in a family, all sorts of things happen. But it doesn't mean that you wag your finger at the people who are experiencing difficulties. No, you create space. And you tell them, this is a purification process going on. Karmic accounts are getting settled. And help people how to get through that part. That's a very important thing. Because otherwise, what happens is what was read in the beginning, which creates a culture of people who want to go away and do Raj Yoga by themselves because they don't know in detail about what happens in a purification process. So this, I think, two things. One, the pedagogy, we need to upgrade it. And another is to make sure that there is this space and this understanding where people really know there's a purification process going on. So there will be eruptions, and eruption is normal. It's okay. There's nothing bad about it. This is what happens in a purification process, and really slow down in the process of finger wagging and telling people to change their sanskaras and all that stuff. Baba tells us all these things in the Murlis. And I think if we churn the Murli as it can be churned, we would understand this. And if anyone understands it and they can explain it to someone who doesn't understand it so that they do understand it, that's helpful, because we're not here to destroy each other. That's not what Shiv Baba had in mind, I don't think. We're not here to, he said, don't compete with each other, compete with Brahma Baba. Everyone will import into BK. They'll import their culture, they'll import their family traditions, they'll import their sanskaras, and so on and so forth. So there's a great deal of mixing up of all of that stuff. But I think that it's useful to open up this subject so that we can actually move forward, because I think especially in this gathering of EGY, people from all over the world who are motivated by what? We like soul consciousness. We want to understand more deeply what is really soul consciousness. How do I become more soul conscious? We like Shiv Baba. He's good, We've been loving him and fighting with him for millennia, right? We're 84 births souls. We've been through everything, and we have lost power. We have got a lot of karmic accounts. We have been affected and influenced by all sorts of things, which has distorted us from our original condition. We love the Murli, right? Even when the translations are a bit funny, we get it and we compensate, and it's okay. We know, no problem. And we have relationships with each other that are lifelong friendships, if not multi-lifelong friendships. Because Baba has selected the creme de la creme of humanity and brought it into his family. So naturally, we will find extraordinary, amazing, wonderful human beings who are from all kinds of different religious, racial, cultural, etc. backgrounds. Because not only we recognize God, we also recognize each other. And what is he doing? He is creating a kingdom, which is complicated. He's creating a family, which is also complicated. He is creating a culture and a civilization in the context of the collapse of the world, in the context of extreme man's inhumanity to man, woman's inhumanity to woman, inhumanity to the animal world, inhumanity to the plant world and the mineral world. It's terrible what's happening, what humanity has become. And in that, Shiv Baba is teaching us to be this new flower, which becomes a new civilization. And we must remember this, and we must really understand well what this process of purification is, so that we do not tear ourselves apart so that we do not break up the yagya into little pieces because it's not necessary, but we just need to understand things in such a way that we really use what Baba has given us in the best possible way. We apply the blessings that he's given us, the instructions that he's given us, and we carry forward as best as we can. So I will stop there, and I will turn it over to Magla. And as you know, Magla and I have lots of conversations. You might have seen our interviews. And then also we will take your questions. Maggie and Rose and Banji will feed these to Magla. So this is how we do this. Om Shanti.
Sister Denise, as now I couldn't help smiling when I heard what you had to say. I think the most prolific thing that you dropped today, the bomb that you dropped today, is that there is suffering involved in purification. Okay? And I think, if you look at it from a legal perspective, when the contract was signed between most BKs and God, most BKs forgot to read the fine print.
Well, right.
Yeah, like
very, very small print.
Yeah. I mean, we were caught up in the awe of it all, and here we are today. 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years later. So the first and obvious question that comes to mind is, what do you do when you find yourself in what you call a high-stress situation where you're experiencing, like many BKs are feeling at the moment, intense suffering, emotionally, physically, financially, psychologically, even. When your dark sanskaras are being brought up to the fore. And Sister Denise, I'm asking you this context, this question in this context. Because we're human, we tend to want to find human solutions to our problems rather than spiritual solutions. I'll give you a clear example. If a Brahmin feels lonely, suddenly lonely, then the question arises now, should I stay here and suffer, or should I go find myself, a friend? So My question is, what do you do when you find yourself in what you call high-stress situations?
When we're talking about all these things, I'm thinking about my own life and what used to happen in that time, as I was growing up in Gyan, very, very close to Dadi Janki, is every time anything would come up, I would express it to her and she would tell me how to interpret it. We don't have things like that now, and we need that. I mean, she would tell me all these matters of suffering. This is all karmic accounts. She was always there for me, and she would give me little mantras, like really good ones. For example, you'd be in a kind of BK situation where something is going on that you really don't like, and she would say, okay, use this mantra. It's happening, but it's not happening to me. It's just happening. You don't have to think that it's happening to you. And if you position yourself like that, you'll be able to manage it. Another one she gave me was, okay, you see all these BKs doing something that you think is not okay. All right, so what you should think is, okay, it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. What it did is that you don't have to have moral indignation, reaction, and so on. You have to understand that in this world, in this process, these things are there. She would always be the counterpoint to the BK publicity. when I was first in Guyana was 1974 when I came in. And at that time, the big piece of news was destruction in 1976. And she would laugh at that idea and say, obviously it's not. There always was a big difference between Daddy Janki's position and all the rest of the BK's position. And so I thought, okay, it means you don't have to take the whole thing on board because people bring in their own thing. And sometimes she would say to me, oh, don't listen to this BK or don't listen to that BK, listen to Baba. And that's a very important thing because everybody brings in their own stuff, And if you think that you have to say Haji to everything and everyone, no, you don't. You say Haji to Shiv Baba. What is Shrimat? There are a lot of BKs who tell you everything that comes out of their mouth is Shrimat. Actually, it's not. To me, Shrimat is 4 things. Very simple. Be soul conscious. Yeah, we go with that. Remember Baba. Yes, that's a good one. Be pure. Good idea. Spin the cycle. Yes, that's it. Shrimat. 4 things. All the rest is recommendations, suggestions, somebody's idea is optional. And you have to keep your own power, keep responsibility for yourself. In terms of what you said about being lonely, Daddy Janki's best friend in Gyan was Didi Manmohini, and they were really good friends. Daddy used to say, now you can't be just equally friends with all the BKs because there are all sorts of different types of BKs. But you be friends with those who are really clean and real and genuine, and they are really studying with pure motivation, and they're doing everything with pure motivation. These kind of people. And what do I have? I have not a large quantity, but a good quantity of people like that in my life because I'm like that. And you find people who are like you, and you have your friends in Gyan. This is a very important sustaining circle. Most of my close friends are not in the same geographical location as where I am. But because you are a soul, and you have technology, you can communicate with people telepathically or through the Zoom or the FaceTime or the WhatsApp or any of those mechanisms. And also when we do service together, do service together with people that are your level, your kind, do the kinds of service projects that corresponds with, what you feel right about. It's not that you just flatten yourself and do everything only for the mass audience and like that. But there are a lot of BKs who will tell you, serve the masses, and I will say to them, no, I can't do that. I will serve the BKs because I like to do that. And sometimes you have to draw lines. These are maryadas. Maryadas is not codes of conduct or however. Maryadas means boundaries, and you have to make your boundaries, and you have to be very clear. This is what I will do. This is what I won't do. And even though it's not told to you to do it like that, but you have to do it like that. And Daddy Janki made it pretty clear to me that, you have to do this and not just be obedient to anybody who comes along and gives you an order. No, that's not how you develop. We really need to articulate this reality and say, hey, no, you have to say no when it's no and yes when it's yes. And that's the way it is.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by we cannot change our sanskaras?
You can change your sanskaras, but not by trying to change them. You have to raise your level of consciousness. Whichever part of the cycle you are in activates those sanskaras that are required at that time in the cycle. So when you're in the Copper Age, you have your Copper Age sanskaras running. When you're in the Iron Age, you have your Iron Age sanskaras running. When you're in the Confluence Age, the whole thing is running. all your sanskaras, from the extreme best ones to the extreme worst ones, from all your weaknesses, all your strengths, everything is just flying all over the place. And you have to manage that, because confluence age means that. We are reversing the cycle. We're going back, all the way back to our original stage. And that is done by this purification process, by the process of making yourself from Tamil Pradhan slowly going back to Sato Pradhan. When you shift your level of consciousness and you really work on your yoga to pull power from Shiv Baba into yourself, there you will activate your progressively pure sanskaras. You see, the problem with yoga is if you pull Baba's power into yourself, it'll cause all of your impurities to get spat out. And so they're all over the place, but it'll also raise your level of consciousness. And unless these things are described as they actually are, when these things are happening, people will think that they're not doing it right, or that they're doing it wrong, or that they themselves are not okay, and blah, blah, blah. So I really strongly believe that you have to tell it like it is, because it's not fair otherwise.
Yeah, the next question is, how do we progress then, and also intensely, in light of what you just said, as there's so little time left?
Well, I think we keep going as we are, but I think the difference is that to talk about this stuff as opposed to not talk about this stuff is actually going to make us move forward quicker. One of the things that came up in Tamazin's survey is that people are experiencing burnout, which means you're saying yes to everything because you believe you have to say yes to everything. And people are doing service in a very inefficient way. You know, all of that causes you to go out of balance. And so I think in some ways we need to put our foot down and say, hey, why are we doing service in the way that we were 50 years ago when we've got everything possible to do it very efficiently and effectively? You have rights. It's just very important to know that you have rights.
How do you create the safe space for those undergoing that suffering? You mentioned about training the trainer or teacher. Should there be a group within a center that will be trained to handle this?
Well, this is normally what people say. You have a little group within the center that'll handle this. It doesn't work. We've been thinking about these things for decades, trying to figure out, okay, what is a good way to do this? And the latest thing that we came up with is this EGY. And because we have Zoom and because it's possible, we can talk about this together. Just talking about a safe space creates a situation where people actually start to use the expression, I need a safe space for this conversation that I'm about to have with you. It has become something that people can demand, that I need to talk about something and I need to talk about it in a safe space, and you have to give me a safe space. And if you can't give me a safe space, then I'll go somewhere else for a safe space. You yourself are understanding what you have a right to and understanding how to claim that right. That seems to me to work a little better. And whenever we come together, either through EGY like this, or we do a retreat, or we do something in Madhuban, if we get there anytime soon, or somewhere else, having this type of conversation, this is the way it's done, having a safe space. This is to be done. This is done. It's not like something weird. No. And this is evolution, natural evolution. And I think that works better.
The follow-up question was that the support group from the safe space, would that go against the idea of do not meddle or solve other people's problems?
You know, one thing is that there are a lot of, what shall I call it, amateur psychologists among BKs who think that they can solve each other's problems. But because they really don't know what they're doing, it really doesn't work, or it's counterproductive. When it becomes a conversation among many and people can come into that conversation, then they're not with one particular person who may try to bring them under their control, because this is the thing, people like to control each other. And when somebody is going through something difficult, they can easily become a victim to somebody who thinks of themselves as the latest, greatest BK shrink. And this is what is meant by meddling in other people's thing. But I think overall, the more people are educated in the reality of this, there'll be less of this victimization, and it will become like a mainstream conversation, and people will really understand better how to take care of themselves in the midst of it, and how to reach out and where to reach out. And I think that this is a process which has been going on for a while, and that it continues to evolve and is getting better. It is normal to go through stuff, and it is a good idea to have people who you can trust and reach out to, who may or may not be seniors, because there's a large number of BKs, and you can't have that personal attention from the super yogis that was possible when I started in Gyan, when there was nobody else around anyway. You know, there was one student and two teachers, and myself, Daddy Changi, and Jantiban. That was it. And then, of course, it became bigger and bigger and enormous. Because I had all of that, I know that there are good ways to do these things, and that it's possible.
How can we avoid suffering? By being purified in the deep silence of Raj Yoga meditation and connecting with Baba in a deeply loving way. So the question is basically, can suffering be avoided?
I don't think so. If you sit with Baba in a very deep and loving way, then you will open up the gates of your subconscious, and your demons will jump out and attack you. And Baba will see if you can handle it. And that's what happens when you do deep Raj Yoga meditation. You can definitely avoid suffering, but you can't avoid pain. And there is a little expression that I used to use a fair amount, that pain is mandatory and suffering is optional. I used the word suffering up until now in this EGY because that's the word that came up in the feedback that was coming. We do need to distinguish between pain and suffering. Do not be afraid of pain. Do not be afraid of Maya. That's the same thing. And suffering is when you try to avoid pain, you get suffering. If you learn how to manage pain, you are really, really ahead. And you learn how to manage pain by surrendering to it, by really working with the power of tolerance, the power of accommodation, by not minding about pain, by not trying to make it go away or trying to become an enemy with it, because pain is a message and we need to work with it. When you do that, the intensity of the pain definitely reduces drastically. The suffering also, because I think suffering is when you don't understand pain and when you object to things. So this is why these mantras, it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. It's happening, but it's not happening to me. It's par for the course. This is the process of purification, and you go with it, you go through it, you flex with it. And that is Raj Yoga. It's not a bowl of cherries. That's the advertising.
Right. Baba once said in a Murli that in the end there will be conflict in the BK family. Can you please expand on that?
And there needs to be conflict within the BK family because all sorts of things have to erupt. Look, BKs have been together for 63 births in all kinds of configurations. So definitely there should be a big explosion in the BK family. It's all right because if you don't have that, things will not fall into place as they should. If you do go with this, that you want to be the best yogi, the best BK, the best, virtuous, what, and just compete with Brahma Baba, you will probably move ahead quite well. And what happens is there's jealousy. And somebody is jealous of somebody because of one reason or another. And so when there's jealousy, they will do whatever they can to take you out, harm you, this or that. And anyone who is a really good BK arouses jealousy in other people. So Daddy Janki used to talk about this, that, there's lots of people who are jealous of me, she said. I mean, you have to not mind about it. You have to not be against them. You have to understand that what they do out of jealousy is okay. You manage it, you accommodate it, and you move forward because you cannot do this path without obstacles. And this is why you are called Vighan Vinashak, the destroyer of obstacles. And so destroying obstacles means managing them, handling them, getting through them, getting past them, and going on anyway. So, I mean, conflict within the BK family, it's okay. It's perfectly fine. Doesn't matter. If you have an assumption that the BK family is a bunch of flowers who are all perfectly fragrant and they just sit there in a vase being fragrant, that's not anything. That's not exciting. That's terribly boring. It's a race. Baba calls it a race. You're racehorses. You're racing to become number one. You have lots and lots of different sanskaras. That everybody's got the massivest ego on the planet. And so when you have lots of big egos, you always have conflict. That's absolutely normal. It's a clash of ego. And if you have enough ego clash, well, presumably the egos will get taken out. Then you will have ego-less, body-less, vice-less people. That's nice, right? It's a game, so enjoy the game. It's a movie, so it has to be exciting. Otherwise, no one will watch it.
There's a lot of questions left, Sister Denise. Some concerns from people all across the globe. Yeah, it's a pity we cannot address them. Maybe it can be recorded and sent onto our group and we can take it up next week. Okay?
Yes.
So, Sister Denise, any last words that you want to leave the family with?
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I think the rest of the questions we can take up the next time because it's a really big subject. I hope everybody's okay with opening up this Pandora box, but I think that it's quite helpful. I hope it's helpful to everybody. And thank you so much, Magala, for coming on today. It's been really great. So, maybe we'll finish with a moment of silence together.